Hi, everybody. It's Lit Review Week. Welcome to week 11 of our English 30/20 online course. And if my tone or the meme that I posted in this week's announcement was any clue, you'll see just how obsessed my husband and I have been with the Great British Baking Show. It's so good. But this week is less about actual baking and more about a lit review, which is your main assignment that's going to be coming due on Sunday. So this instructor video, I want to talk all things lit review. I want to go over in detail some of the requirements of this portion of your Project 3 paper. And I want to look at a sample lit review just to kind of see some points about organization, construction, and synthesizing your sources together. So, without any further ado, I'm going to switch over to our Canvas view and I'll show you guys the overview of assignments for this week, and then we'll get into talking about the lit review. Okay, so here we are, week 11. We have this week and then 2 more weeks, and Project 3 will be completed. And we'll spend the last 2 weeks of the semester looking at Project 4. Here, though, in week 11, we are working on probably the bulkiest piece of your Project 3. So, not only this week are you going to watch this instructor video, which you're already doing, high five, you're going to continue finding sources and taking field notes as appropriate. Especially keep up with those field notes, because next week, even though your lit review draft is going to be loosely finished, though you may have some revisions to do, your field notes are really going to be relevant next week when you start thinking about your results section. We're going to end the week with a peer review, so get excited because you'll be able to give and receive feedback on your literature review drafts. And we do have one reflection journal just to sort of keep us thinking about our service work and how that's going. So, like a loose schedule for this week would be by Wednesday to make sure you've watched the video and at least thought about your reflection journal. You're doing secondary research and taking field notes. You probably want to have your lit review drafted by Friday or Saturday in a pinch, because if you can get it posted to the thread earlier, probably the more and better feedback that you'll receive by Sunday. Okay, so let's talk about this literature review. In our peer mentor check-ins, folks had some great questions for Carly and Kat about sources and what's it supposed to look like and how's it supposed to be structured, and I told both of the peer mentors that they both had excellent responses. Yeah, they're spot on. Basically, your lit review is going to be a synthesis of secondary sources that connect directly to your research question. In terms of the assignment, we'll have to go back to the Project 3 assignment description to get some of those nitty-gritty details, but I'm just going to walk you through them in case you forgot. So within this ethnography, where you are participant observers with St. Vincent Sarah Fisher, you're taking field notes, observing what's going on around you and developing your research question out of things that you're noticing. The literature review, the details about it are here in the assignment prompt, right? So technicalities, I'm asking you to gather 8 to 10 credible sources. And more on that in a second. They should support your research question and the issue or topic that you are noticing. So once again, if you're thinking about student engagement mediated by screens, or if you're thinking about attention spans and work environments in online education, or if you're thinking about the frustrations of GED students not being able to free up the time to do their tutoring, any and all of those topics that we kind of talked about in last week's video, you're going to want to be reading into that, right? We talked about last week you needed to be getting started if you hadn't started already. And this week, for real, you need to have those good sources. You want to be evaluating them for quality and not just desperately grasping at straws. I have a tip for that in a second, but I'll get to that. But here, for this lit review, I'm asking you to shoot for 4 to 5 pages. So like I said, this is the bulkiest piece of your project 3 so far, and probably all together. So a couple weeks ago, you guys drafted your methods sections, which was just basically describing ethnography and how you were going to go about doing your observations and recording your field notes. This is the place where you're going to be pulling together all those secondary sources. Next week, we're going to work on your results section, which is where you look at your field notes, analyze the patterns, the things that you noticed, and put them into conversation with what you're doing in the lit review here. So again, this is the place where you're trying to pull together what we call the conversation around your topic. So the lit review itself should not critique the work, beliefs, or cultures that appear in the community site or in your observations. Instead, you should be exploring the intersections between what you're noticing and what other people are already saying. That's the thing, right? What you're noticing and your primary research is what you will contribute to this extant conversation about the issue or topic that you're investigating. So when it comes to your lit review, majority of scholarly sources, 5 to 7 peer-reviewed journal articles, scholarly press books, governmental data, professional or scholarly websites. So you want the bulk of your sources to come from these academic places, though you do get up to 3 supplemental sources. So that could be newspaper articles, community newsletters, popular press books, blogs, podcasts, organization or community websites. Any of those things could be supplements to the more scholarly sources that you're collecting. Does that make sense? Okay. So I have an example literature review here. I'm not going to walk through it line by line, but I do want to do a quick sort of genre analysis to show you some of the features that make a solid academic literature review. Now, this literature review is part of a larger project. This student is writing about cyberbullying, and I thought that this would be a good example to show you guys because it's dealing with a digitally mediated phenomenon, which is what you're dealing with your tutoring. But I want to show you a couple specific things. So first of all, you see that the review of the literature comes after a brief introduction. It's just a couple of paragraphs, probably a page total. Then comes the review of literature. So the intro, which you guys haven't done a draft of yet, but you'll put an intro in your ethnography. It needs to introduce your topic, your method loosely, and your research question. Then it's sort of like we zoom out to this literature review. And if you've ever used a Prezi, you know how this works, right? Like maybe your introduction gives you one square of the image, but then your literature review zooms out and you see all the squares. And this is what we want to do. We want to zoom out and see all of the different scholars who have written about your topic or something that's tangential to your topic. So this writer is talking about cyberbullying, and they start by talking about the prevalence or the frequency of cyberbullying, and they cite a couple of different studies within this intro paragraph. So they've got Foucher, Jackson, and Cassidy, and down here, Vege, Van de Bosch, and Egermont. And then here, Van der Bosch, and Van Klimpet. Now, I want to show you something. This, again, we're not looking like line by line at this, but I want to show you something interesting, right? So we've got Van der Bosch here and Van der Bosch here, or Vander, maybe there's an R missing. The point is, same name, same scholar, I'm presuming. And I bet that either the student found this source or they found this source first. I'm betting they found this source first. And then they looked at who that article cited. And so this is one of my key strategies. If you're still struggling to gather your secondary sources, but maybe you found one or two articles that really just blow your hair back and they really just seem perfect. Your next move is to go to the works cited of those articles and cherry pick like mad. Just cannibalize that works cited so that you can be pulling together similar studies. If your perfect article cited someone else, it is relevant because they're citing it, right? So you can kind of trace back almost like a genealogy within a work cited to find other sources that will be relevant also to you. Sometimes students don't like to do that because they feel like it's cheating somehow, but it is not. It is a very common practice amongst professional scholars like myself, is to know not just what one particular scholar says, but who that scholar is citing, because it places that scholar within a conversation. And then as a scholar myself, I can either join that conversation or say something about that conversation that's relevant to my point in my paper. Does that make sense? Okay. So use those works cited. Then, as you're writing your lit review, this is where organization is key. Within your lit review, you very well may have subsections. So for example, this writer has their first section, which is the prevalence of cyberbullying. They go on to talk about the types of people who bully, and they have a couple of different sources here to support that. The types of people who are victims of cyberbullying, they've got several sources here. The relationship between bully and victim. So far, these three central sections seem to flow pretty naturally together because it's all about the people and the relationships present within the phenomenon of cyberbullying. Then we have this whole section here about the effects of cyberbullying, how victims might cope, and different forms that cyberbullying can take. Now, I want you to notice how this writer brings it down at the very end of the lit review to their research question. This is a classic and really important move to master when you're creating a literature review. Now, for you guys, I don't necessarily want you to write RQ1. You can if you want, but it does kind of create a little bit of a jarring transition here. The point is that when we write a literature review, we can imagine it as in a shape, and that shape is a cone shaped, not a cylinder, a cone. It's wider at the top, and it gets narrower and more specific at the bottom to the point where it ends up at your research question. Now, here is a critique I would make of this example literature review. If I was this writer, knowing that I was moving towards this research question, how does the lack of physical intimidation affect people's inclination to cyberbully? I might actually put forms of cyberbullying and effects of cyberbullying up higher to underneath the prevalence of cyberbullying. And I would take these three sections that we said were all about relationships and the people involved, and I might move them to the bottom. Because if we're thinking about the types of people who bully, the types of people who are victims, and the relationship between bully and victim, this could lead us fairly seamlessly to the research question, which is about motivation of cyberbullies. So within this lit review, another thing I want to show you is how the sources are treated. So the one thing that you should notice is that this whole paper is written in APA style. How do we know that? Well, we know that putting the dates in parentheses after your authors, that's APA in text citation style. MLA would put the page number at the end of the sentence before the punctuation, right? Now, the thing that you should see is that there are very few quotations here, very few quote sandwiches. This is mostly summary and a little bit paraphrase, but mostly summary of the studies. This is what allows for several sources to be mushed together within one paragraph, because the summary that's going on here, the writer has an intro sentence or two that's transitioning into this section, right? Researchers have also conducted various studies on the types of people who are cyberbullied. And then that's all the writer's words transitioning into summary of the first study. Then there's a little bit of analysis of that source, that study. And then we have, check it out, within this section, 2 paragraphs. So here's paragraph 1, where it's still the same structure as a quote sandwich. It's just a summary sandwich. You've got your lead in, your top piece of bread up here. You've got the summary. You've got the analysis and the lead out. Then we have a second paragraph. And this is also going to talk about the same section. So it's, again, we don't want this whole section to be one monolithic paragraph. We want to break it up into its individual ideas, right? So this first paragraph was about, broadly, types of people. And they found that it was varied. But here we're switching. Did you notice this transition word here? While not many studies look at the gender of victims, many studies do research things such as the characteristics of the victims. So now we're getting into the how we identify the types. Up here, the first paragraph was talking about classification of types of people, and the second paragraph is talking about how we get there. And then we have this little lead out paragraph that closes out the whole section. So I said 2 before, I was wrong. There's actually 3 paragraphs within this section. And so it might go with you. You might have more than 3 paragraphs. You might have fewer. But make sure that you're thinking about organization, not just in terms of your sections, but also in terms of your paragraphs. 1 idea per paragraph. Now, that does not mean it has to be 1 source per paragraph, because as you see here, there are 3, well, at least 2 different sources in play. 2 sources talking about the same idea is perfectly fine. That's a happy thing to have within a paragraph. Okay. So hopefully this was helpful to kind of look at a few examples here and see how the summary sandwiches are working, how the organization of sections is working, and how the paragraphs within a section are working. Now, I'm going to pull it back to our full view and close out this video. All right. So one of the things I wanted to say for this week is that I am so glad so many of you have emailed me to make appointments to talk to me in Zoom office hours, and I'm stoked about it. I, in fact, am completely booked as of this moment. All of my availability is completely booked for this week. But if you still want to talk to me, hang in there. We can definitely schedule something for next week. If you want to talk to me about your lit review specifically as you're drafting it, please feel free to email me. I'm happy to answer questions or look at sections of your literature review and give you feedback via